Have you ever been in a place so old, so drenched in silence, that it felt like time had simply stopped? Like the walls were waiting to speak? I have, and I've been carrying what happened inside me for over a year now. Every night, I wake up at 3:17, the exact moment I heard the first knock from inside the wall. I've tried to forget it, bury it under drywall and rational explanations. But the truth doesn't go away just because you seal it behind bricks, and what I found behind that wall, it never left me. My name is Michael Harlan. I'm a carpenter, 22 years in the trade. I specialize in restoration. Old barns, historic homes, churches, bringing the dead wood back to life. That's what I do. I've worked on over a dozen historic buildings in Pennsylvania, but none prepared me for St. Emery's Church. It was tucked away in a forgotten valley near Ashridge, abandoned for decades, a stone structure over 200 years old, swallowed by creeping ivy and silence. The church was to be restored and converted into a community center. The project was a big deal. Historic grants, architectural preservationists involved, even some buzz in the local paper. But for me, it was just another job. At first, the kind of job I'd tell my apprentices to be proud of. Solid stonework, ancient oak beams, craftsmanship from another century. But St. Emery's held something else within its walls, something that had waited centuries to be noticed. And the moment I tore into that eastern wall of the nave, I unearthed more than just rotted timbers. I found bones, and that was only the beginning. So if you're still listening, understand that this isn't just a story about what I saw. It's about what I released, what was locked away, forgotten, unforgiven. Let me tell you what really happened inside St. Emery's. St. Emery's wasn't on any map you'd casually find. You had to know where to look, past the crumbling stone bridge, through a tunnel of trees that seemed to bend inward like a throat about to swallow. The path was barely more than a dirt trail, choked with moss and roots. But it opened onto a clearing where the church stood like something that had clawed its way up from the earth. The first time I saw it, I couldn't move. There was a stillness to it. Its stones were blackened in patches, like it had once caught fire and never fully recovered. The bell tower leaned slightly to the left, the topmost window gaping open like a screaming mouth. I remember the wind stopping as I stepped onto the overgrown path to the entrance. The air just stalled, not a sound, not a single bird. Inside, the nave stretched long and narrow, flanked by rotting pews. The altar was nothing but a stone slab, cracked clean down the middle. Above it, a faded fresco of Saint Dismas, the penitent thief, his eyes gone, scratched out by time or intent. But it was the silence that got to me, the kind that doesn't feel empty but full, like something unseen was still praying, or listening. I was brought in by a historical society working with the state. They wanted the church restored, not modernized. My job was structural: reinforce the roof, repair stonework, and open the sealed eastern transept for planned archival space. A straightforward contract, or so I thought. The team was small. Lydia, the project coordinator, who had a historian's passion but none of the caution. Tom, a stonemason I trusted with my life. And Father Alden, a retired priest, brought in to advise on the religious artifacts. Though something about his eyes told me he knew more than he let on. There was also the eastern transept itself. That part of the church had been sealed off entirely, stone bricked from the inside. No records explained why. No photographs showed what was inside. Lydia called it an architectural mystery. Tom called it bad construction. But when I stood in front of that bricked wall on my first day, I felt watched. Something in my gut told me this wall wasn't built to keep something out. It was built to keep something in. It started with the cold. We hadn't even broken into the eastern transept yet. We were still clearing rot from the sacristy and replacing old joists near the altar. But even with the summer heat outside, upper 80s, sun high and angry inside that church, the temperature would drop without warning. 1 minute sweat would be dripping down my back. The next I'd see my breath fog in the air. At first I blamed the stonework or drafts from the broken window, but the drops weren't consistent. They happened in only one spot, along the eastern wall, the sealed one. Tom felt it too. "You ever get the feeling," he said one afternoon, "that this place doesn't want to be fixed?" I laughed it off. That's what you do on job sites when nerves start talking louder than logic. But deep down, I was starting to feel the same thing. Then there were the knocks. At first they were distant, soft, irregular. You'd be drilling or hauling boards, and just underneath the noise you'd think you heard a tap, a pause, then another, always in threes. Lydia was the first to bring it up. She'd been cataloging artifacts in what used to be the choir loft. Said she kept hearing someone walking below, pacing back and forth. She came down thinking it was me, but I'd been outside cutting stone, Sounded like someone in heavy boots, she said. Slow, deliberate steps, like a priest. We laughed, joked about old spirits checking in on our work. But that night, the alarm system, brand new, motion sensitive, went off. Twice. The caretaker swore no one had entered. The cameras showed nothing. Just the red sensor light flickering in that one hallway, the one that ran alongside the bricked transept wall. But it wasn't until I overheard Father Alden that I started to worry. I was working late, sanding a new beam for the nave, when I heard his voice in the sanctuary. He didn't know I was still there. He was praying soft, urgent Latin, but not like a normal prayer. It sounded like pleading, like bargaining. I heard him say a word I didn't recognize then. Inimicorum non dimititur. Later I looked it up. It means the unforgiven enemies are not released. I didn't tell anyone. But from that night on, I never worked alone in that church again. I'm not the kind of guy who snoops through paperwork. I build things, not dig through filing cabinets. But after that night with Father Alden, something shifted in me. The job started feeling less like restoration, and more like archaeology. Except whatever we were digging into wasn't meant to be unearthed. It began with the church's original blueprints. I found them tucked inside a leather folio in the back of a storage cabinet. Most of the sheets were brittle, faded, almost illegible, but one stood out, dated 1823, hand-drawn. It showed the entire layout of St. Emery's nave, sacristy, choir loft, and the eastern transept. But here's the thing, it wasn't a wall back then. It was labeled Confessarium Dei Septem, the Confession of the Seven Gods. There's no such rite in Catholic tradition. I asked Father Alden about it the next day casually. His face went still. That part of the church was sealed off after a tragic incident, he said, carefully choosing his words. There were elements of heretical practice that needed to be corrected, for the good of the parish. I asked him if the Confession of the Seven Gods was one of those elements. He didn't answer. Instead he handed me a weathered envelope. Inside were old photographs, black and white, curling at the edges. They showed a figure kneeling in front of the altar, surrounded by 7 crosses. But they weren't ordinary crosses. Each bore a strange symbol, sharp angles, runes I didn't recognize. The final photo was different. It showed the eastern wall as it is now, bricked shut, freshly mortared, with a single phrase carved into the keystone. Nemo absolvitur. No one is absolved. I asked Lydia if she'd ever heard of anything unusual in the church's history. She went quiet. I did find something in the diocesan records, she said. An incident in 1844. A priest was excommunicated. His name was Father Murnane, accused of experimental penance rituals. He was never tried, just disappeared. That name, Murnane, kept echoing in my mind. Later that week, while clearing debris behind the organ chamber, I found a rusted doorframe that had been boarded over. It led to a crawl space. Inside was a rusted lockbox. It took a crowbar to get it open. Inside were bones, small ones, child-sized, and beneath them a cloth bundle, wrapped tight in crimson-stained linen. I didn't open it. Not then. I couldn't. My hands were shaking too hard. When I showed it to Tom, he went pale. Mike, this ain't just old history. Someone wanted this hidden. Someone built a wall to make sure no one ever saw this again. And the deeper we looked, the more we realized what we found wasn't forgotten. It was buried. We didn't touch the bones. Not official. Lydia called the authorities the next morning, and a representative from the historical division came to examine the crawl space. They took photos, logged everything, then left with a promise to follow up. That was 3 weeks ago. No one ever came back. But the wall kept speaking. On the 3rd night after the discovery, I woke up in a cold sweat. I'd fallen asleep in my truck outside the site, too wired to drive home. Something had woken me, a sound I couldn't place at first. It wasn't a dream. I was sure I'd heard it. Not from the door, from inside the church, from inside the wall. The next morning I came in early. Tom wasn't there yet. Lydia was off-site, talking to preservation consultant. I stood in front of that bricked transept wall, tools in hand, sweat already soaking through my shirt even though the morning was cool. I pressed my palm to the stone. It was warm. Not ambient, not sun-warmed masonry. Radiating warmth, like something alive beneath it. Something weight. I don't know what came over me. I didn't ask permission. I didn't care. I grabbed the hammer and chisel and started cutting into the mortar. By the time Tom arrived, I'd exposed about 3 square feet. The bricks were older than they should have been, handmade. But what froze us both was what we saw behind them. Wood, not just structural support. A door, an interior wooden door, ancient and iron-banded, built into the wall itself. and carved into it, scratched, not chiseled, was a symbol I'll never forget. A circle of 7 eyes. One of them was crossed out. Tom asked if I'd ever seen anything like it before. I hadn't, but when I looked closer, I saw something that made my skin crawl. There were scratch marks on the inside of the door, deep ones, human, desperate. We didn't open it that day. We told ourselves we needed to clear it with Lydia first, but I think we both knew. Neither of us wanted to know what was behind that door. Later that night, the power in the church failed for the first time. All the motion lights, the sensors, the backup batteries, everything went dead, except for the bell that no one had touched in decades. It rang, once, at exactly 3:17 a.m. I didn't sleep the night after the bell rang. I sat outside the church in my truck, staring at the silhouette of the steeple against the stars. I should have left, walked away, called the historical board, packed my tools, moved on to the next contract, but something kept me there. Curiosity maybe, or guilt. Like the moment I laid eyes on that door, I'd entered into a kind of pact, silent binding. I arrived before dawn, before anyone else. The church was cold, darker than usual. I used my headlamp to find my way to the transept. The door was still there, waiting like it had always been part of the church's bones. And the scratch marks, they looked deeper, fresher. I don't know what made me do. Maybe it was the pressure behind my eyes, the buzz under my skin like a warning or a challenge. I gripped the iron handle and pulled. The door opened with a long, low creak, like breath held for centuries was finally being exhaled. What lay beyond wasn't a room in the normal sense. It was a chamber, stone-lined, circular, with 7 recesses carved into the walls, each shaped like an alcove for a statue, but they were all empty, except one. In the far alcove, slumped forward in the shadows, was a figure. At first I thought it was a statue, a carved effigy, left behind by monks, or cultists, or whoever the hell had built this place. But as I stepped closer, the truth set in with a quiet, skin-tightening horror. It was a body, desiccated, dressed in what looked like tattered vestment, the head bowed forward, hands clutching a stone tablet, etched with more of those same symbols, the 7 eyes, the one blacked out, and behind the body, smeared on the stone wall in something long dried and dark, words. I was their voice. Now I am their silence. Do not forgive me. I backed out of the chamber without breathing, sealed the door, didn't speak of it to anyone, not to Lydia, not to Tom, not even when Father Alden came by that afternoon and stood staring at the sealed wall for a long time, whispering words in Latin I didn't recognize. But that night, I saw the figure again, not in the chamber, in my dream. It stood at the foot of my bed, eyes hollow, mouth moving, but no sound came out, only silence. And that silence was louder than any scream I've ever heard. It started as murmurs. Not loud, not threatening, just constant, soft threads of sound that seemed to drift in from nowhere, like wind through a keyhole. I'd hear them when I was alone, sanding floorboards, repairing joists, checking inventory in the storage shed. At first I chalked it up to the pressure, the stress of what we'd found, but deep down I knew better. The whispers weren't in English, and they weren't in Latin either. I tried recording them, left my phone on overnight in the nave, tucked beneath the old pew. When I played it back the next day, I expected silence. Maybe some ambient creaks, or a mouse skittering through plaster. But the recording wasn't silent. There was a voice. Male. Rough. Desperate. Repeating a single phrase, Libera nos a sanguine, over and over. Deliver us from blood. I brought the audio to Father Alden. His hands shook as he listened. When it ended, he looked at me like he was seeing me for the first time. You shouldn't have opened it, he said. You weren't meant to. That night, Lydia called me. She was crying, said she'd been reviewing some of the digital scans from the church archives and found an entry not in the restoration records, but buried in something called the Book of Unsanctioned Rites. It was dated 1832 and detailed a practice labeled penitent interim. She read it to me, voice shaking. Those who bear sin beyond absolution must be sealed with their truth. The wall is the veil. The silence is the penance. Let no tongue speak their name, lest silence become hunger. That phrase burned in my skull, silence become hunger. After that, the whispers changed. They weren't just murmuring anymore. They were calling my name. I'd hear it from behind the transept wall, from beneath the floorboards. Michael. Over and over. Sometimes a whisper, sometimes a gasp. One night, while I was working late alone, I heard it so clearly I turned and answered. There was no one there. But when I looked back at the wall, I swear I saw it, just for a second, breathing. The stone pulsed, like a lung. And behind it, something waited. Not to be found, but to be remembered. Lydia didn't come back to the site after that night. She quit the project, said she'd send her notes from home. I think she was scared, and she should have been. But I stayed. I told myself it was about finishing the job, pride, reputation, but it wasn't. Not really. I needed to know what had happened in that church, why the wall was built, why there were bones inside, and why I couldn't stop dreaming of that figure in the chamber. Its eyes hollow, its mouth whispering truths in a language I didn't understand. So I went back to the archive. Most of the records were exactly what you'd expect. Restoration notes, sacramental logs, a few hand-scrawled notes about budget overruns. But behind one of the rotting cabinet drawers, wrapped in oilskin, I found a different kind of book, thinner than the others, untitled. It wasn't church records. It was a ledger. Each page had a name, a date, and a phrase written in Latin, but no sacrament listed, no baptism, no marriage, no death. The phrase was always the same, non dimittitur, not forgiven. 34 names were listed. 34, each with the same final notation, inturitus voluntarius, voluntary destruction. But next to the 35th name, there was something different. Instead of a Latin phrase, there was just one word written in red ink, name. No title, no date, no explanation. Just that name. The same name Lydia had found buried in the diocesan black files. The excommunicated priest, the one who vanished, the one who was supposed to be removed from all official record. This wasn't a ledger of sin. It was a register of those sealed behind the wall. And Murnane. He wasn't just one of the damned. He was the last one to judge them all. I stared at the page for what felt like hours, because beneath the red ink barely visible, like it had been scratched in afterward, I could make out one more name. My name. Michael Harlan. There's a point where belief stops being a choice. When the evidence piles so high it buries your doubts like dirt over a coffin. Finding my name in that book, it should have been impossible. I hadn't told anyone I was coming to St. Emery's. I wasn't born in this town. I had no history here, no blood ties. But there it was, my name, scratched in with something darker than ink, etched so deep it had bled through the page. That night I didn't go home. I stayed in the sacristy. Tried to sleep on a cot beneath a cracked window, clutching a crowbar, like it could protect me from whatever had taken an interest in me. And the dreams came harder. I saw the chamber again, but this time, the figure was standing, eyes weeping black, whispering not Latin, but English. One phrase, over and over. You opened the door, now open the debt. I jolted awake with the taste of ash in my mouth. The transept wall had changed. The bricks were damp, not with water, with something thicker, something red. The mortar bled. It left streaks like tears. Tom came in early that morning and found me still staring at it. He asked what happened. I didn't lie. I told him everything about the book, the chamber, the names. He didn't speak for a long time. Then he said, "You ever hear the stories about this place before it closed down?"
I shook my head.
Locals called it the Confession Church. Said it was cursed. Said if you entered with a lie on your soul, it wouldn't let you leave. That's why they sealed that wing. People weren't just being forgiven in there, they were being measured. I asked him what that meant. He didn't answer, but later that day, Tom was gone. He left all his tools, his truck, vanished without a word. His phone went straight to voicemail. No one saw him again. That night, the whispers didn't wait for sleep. They followed me into waking hours. And the figure, the one from the chamber, it stood in the nave as I worked, watching, silent, until I blinked, and it was gone. After Tom disappeared, something broke in me. This wasn't just a haunting, it was a reckoning, and I was already part of it, woven into a ritual that had been sealed away for centuries. I started hearing the voice in places it shouldn't be. My phone would ring, just once, always at 3:17 a.m. No number, just silence on the other end, silence that breathed. The night after Tom vanished, I stood in front of the transept wall, alone again. No one would come near the church anymore. Even Lydia had stopped responding to my messages. I pressed my hand to the cold stone and whispered, "What do you want from me?" The voice answered, "Not in the wall, in me." It didn't use words, it used memory. I saw myself at 16 standing in my childhood kitchen, hands shaking after something I still can't say out loud. A mistake, a choice, Something I buried so deep, I'd convinced myself it never happened. But the church remembered. It whispered the name I never spoke again. It showed me the face I've avoided in every mirror since. It didn't punish me. It held up the truth like a lantern. I fell to my knees in the nave, dry heaving, gasping, sobbing. It wasn't guilt. It was exposure. That was its power. That was the curse of the unforgiven. They weren't evil. They weren't damned. They were the ones who told the truth when no one else would. And for it, they were locked away, not by God, by the church, by men, and now one of them, Murnane, wanted out, but not to escape, to finish what he started. That night, the voice spoke clearly for the first time, right behind me, as if it was standing no more than a breath away. You are the key. You are the key. Those words weren't metaphor. They were literal. The next morning I went back to the ledger, stared at my name still scratched in beneath the red ink. Beneath it, in a nearly invisible script I hadn't noticed before, were 3 symbols. I recognized them. One was on the chamber door. Another was carved into the altar. The third was burned into the underside of the pew I always sat in. These weren't just decorations, they were part of a lock, and I had just started unlocking it. I didn't know how, but every step I took, every wall I breached, every truth I uncovered, it was feeding giving it form, a body, a purpose, and it was almost complete. I went back to the chamber. I knew I shouldn't, but I had to see if the figure was still there. It wasn't. The stone tablet it had once clutched lay shattered on the floor. The chamber was colder than before, not the cold of winter, but the cold of absence, of something that had been still for centuries and had finally moved. The church groaned above me, a deep structural sound, like the bones of the building were shifting, protesting what had been disturbed. Then I heard the voice, not whispers, not memory, chanting, coming from the nave. When I reached it, I froze. They were there, 7 figures standing where the pews had been, cloaked in rot and shadow, faces hidden, hands clasped. Each stood where the alcoves in the chamber would have aligned above ground, a perfect mirror, and in the center, where the altar had once stood, was Murnane, not flesh, not spirit, something in between. He lifted his hand and pointed to the transept wall, and I understood. They weren't trying to escape. They were waiting for permission, and I was the one giving it. I ran, out of the nave, through the sacristy, into the blinding morning sun, but even daylight felt wrong, dim, like it couldn't quite reach me anymore, like the shadows I'd stirred had followed me out of the church, but I couldn't leave. Not really. I didn't know it yet, but the moment I pulled that first brick from the wall, I stopped being a witness. I became the final link. I came back that night, alone, no tools, no phone, just a lantern, a crowbar, and the creeping knowledge that something ancient had chosen. I don't know what I planned to do, seal the chamber again, burn it, pray. But when I walked into the nave I knew it was too late. The pews were gone, all of them, vanished. In their place was a circle of scorched wood on the stone floor. In the center stood Murnane. He didn't, but I felt his eyes on me, not rage, not even hatred. Just recognition, like I was a mirror showing him what he used to be. I shouted at him, "What do you want from me?" And the voice that answered came from everywhere, not just Murnane, the entire church. "You opened the you are the final confession." I backed away. "No," I said. "I didn't sin like the others. I didn't do what you—" But the voice cut me off. "You lied, and silence feeds us." I understood then. This was never about absolution. It was about truth. They weren't trying to escape judgment. They were the judgment, and Murnane, he wasn't their leader. He was their prisoner, their martyr, their mouthpiece. He took a step forward. Stone cracked beneath him, and then I saw them behind the altar, emerging from the walls, the others, eyes closed, mouths sewn shut. But one by one, the threads snapped, and they began to speak. Their voices weren't screams. They were names, one after another. Some ancient whispered like forgotten prayers, others were recent, familiar, personal. Each name hit like a hammer, a sin remembered, a secret dragged into the open air, and the last name they spoke was mine. Michael Harlan. The church shook, not metaphorically, literally. Stones rumbled in their sockets, dust rained from the ceiling. The transept wall, the one I had opened, cracked from top to bottom with a sickening groan. I fell to my knees, not because I wanted to, because I had to. Like gravity had changed, like the air thickened until standing was no longer allowed. And Murnane, his face was clear now. Not a ghost, not a monster. A man. Eyes hollow, skin like parchment, hands trembling. Not with rage, but with exhaustion, like he'd carried this burden too long. You don't understand, I whispered. I didn't know, I didn't mean to. But he raised a finger, pointed to my chest. You remember, you chose to forget, that is your sin. It wasn't murder. It wasn't theft. It was willful silence, a truth I buried long ago because it was easier than facing it. The others, the ones sewn shut, began to hum, low, harmonic, vibrating through the floor, and I knew what was coming next. They weren't going to kill me. They were going to make me speak, and I wasn't ready for that. I screamed until my throat tore. I confessed everything. Every lie, every sin of omission. Every face I'd turned away from, every cry I'd ignored. The chanting stopped. The seven fell still, and Murnane, he looked at me with something I never expected. Pity. Then he turned toward the altar and said the final words I will never forget. The silence has been broken, let the debt rest. And with that, the church collapsed around me. The ceiling cracked first. A sound like thunder split into pieces, followed by the groan of timber and the scream of stone. The floor trembled beneath me, the very foundations of St. Emery's giving up their grip on time. But I didn't run, I couldn't. The altar burst apart like it had been struck from within. The walls bowed outward, weeping centuries of dust and sorrow, and in the center of it all, Murnane stood unmoving, his robes turning to ash, his body crumbling like paper soaked in flame. The seven, they vanished, not in a puff of smoke or a flash of light, but like shadows fading at dawn. Their presence didn't retreat, it lifted, as if they had finally been heard. And then, silence, real silence, not the haunted kind I'd grown used to, not the pressure of waiting doom, just quiet. And a single question, as clear as a bell toll in my head. Will you seal it, or finish it? I knew what it meant. I could rebuild the wall, bury the truth again, let the stone hold the shame for another century, pretend none of this ever happened. Or, I could leave it open, let the truth rot in the light where it belonged. I stood there, my face covered in dust, blood from my scraped hands drying into the lines of my palms, and I made the choice. I gathered every tool, every sacred relic, every remnant of that chamber. I piled them in the name, and I set it all on fire. Not to destroy, but to purify. The flames rose slow, like they too understood what they were consuming. The old oak beams screamed. The stone groaned, and as I walked out, I didn't look back. I didn't need to. Because the church was no longer a tomb. It was a confession. And for once, the dead had been heard. That was a year ago. St. Emery's is gone now. Reduced to a hollowed ruin, overtaken by vines and silence. The restoration project was quietly dissolved. No news reports. No official statement. Just an insurance payout, and a few whispers about unexpected structural instability. But I know what really happened. I live a few towns over now. No more contracts. I don't touch churches. I don't even walk past them. I tell myself I'm retired. But every night, I still wake up at exactly 3:17 a.m. There's no sound, no voice. Just a presence. Waiting. Sometimes I dream of Murnane. Not as he was in that chamber, but as a man, tired, gentle, walking through halls of stone, whispering names into the dark. Other times I hear the names again, not screamed, not chanted, confessed, and I think about the others, the ones still buried in silence, the secrets in other walls, in other churches, in the spaces where shame and faith were confused for one another. We sealed so much behind stone, but stone remembers, and now, so do I. So if you're ever walking near a church and feel a cold breath against your skin, or hear a name you haven't thought of in years whispered in a voice that isn't yours, don't ignore it. Because some truths refuse to stay buried, and silence is just another kind of hunger.